Let's get going. Thank you all for being here this evening. This is the start of it's the first of three webinars I'll be running on Monday nights at 7 o'clock Pacific time, just in case somebody is here that's not from Vancouver. And what we're going to be doing in these webinars, is I'm going to talk about how a jazz concert is different from perhaps an orchestral concert you've been to before, especially if you've been to a Right Rock City Orchestra concert before. Tonight's webinar, I'll be going through a little bit of the what's different, what's so special, why are we doing a jazz concert? And then I'm going to talk a little about, just quickly, a very, very short history of jazz. And then I'll talk a little bit about the music styles. And I've got some recordings which I'll share with you, hopefully to explain and demonstrate how different styles of jazz can sound. A quick introduction. I'm actually well known in my presentations, and I literally do hundreds of presentations a year. I forget to introduce myself. So my name is Bruce Petherick. Tonight I'm representing the White Rock City Orchestra. I am the piano player for the orchestra, and I've been in the orchestra just over a year now. Some of you may have seen some of our earlier concerts. I also do some arranging for the orchestra. And I'm here because I volunteered, but also I've got some pretty extensive jazz background, jazz experience. I played jazz when I was quite young, back when I was growing up in Australia. I have played with some pretty famous people. The name's just to drop, just because I can do this. I played with the Count Basie Orchestra just a little bit after Bill Basie died, and I've also played with the Woody Herman Orchestra, the Glenn Miller Regional Orchestra. That's the orchestra that's continued after World War II. And other musicians in Australia, especially, and some musicians here in Canada. And I toured the world playing both classical and jazz. And probably the most exotic thing I've done is I was a headliner for two jazz festivals in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. And yes, there is jazz in Mongolia. Okay, so let's go and talk a little bit about why we're doing this. It's come to my attention that as musicians, we tend to assume that the audience knows what's going on. And I think that's a misconception now for us in the modern world. And we, at the White Rock City Orchestra, we're going to start doing a little bit more education through these type of formats, through videos, to prepare people before they go to the concert, because it's a different experience. If you've been to an orchestral concert with us, or even at the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra, or in an opera, any of the opera houses around the world, people traditionally get dressed up. It's very formal, and quite honestly, I don't like it. I call it a penguin suit. And most musicians actually do, because it makes it look like penguins. And there's this just tradition, and has been for 150 years, of more formal dress when you go to a classical orchestra concert or an opera or the ballet. Jazz concerts are not like that. Going to experience jazz, especially at a jazz club, is a lot more relaxed. And even though we're doing a concert with a full orchestra, and also a jazz trio, and also our special guest, Dee Daniels, I want everybody to realize that this is a chance to be maybe a little bit more relaxed. Wear something you feel comfortable in. We'll be getting close to, cold winter time, so wear something warm, but don't think of it like a formal orchestral concert. If you want to get dressed up, that's great, but you don't have to. One of the other things I like to talk about is etiquette at the concert, very specifically when you're in the performance. again, traditionally with an orchestra performance, one is not supposed to clap between movements if a piece has multi-movements. And again, personally, I find that strange. I think if you want to clap, clap. However, the etiquette in jazz is different. And there's a tradition to really maybe express your
Oh, he's
uh,
gone.
feelings and your emotions a little bit more in the moment.
Oh, he's
Um,
gone.
so things like if somebody in the orchestra has a solo and you think that was exciting, clap. You can clap. You can show your enjoyment. You can show your expression in the concert rather than waiting for a break. It's okay. That's allowed. If we can say anything's allowed in any way whatsoever. So this is a different experience, a much more um, relaxed experience. Roy's just asked a question. Can you clap during a solo? Yes, you can actually. Um, Especially if there's something that the musician has done in the moment that moves you to express that, do it. Do it. From a performance perspective, it's a jazz tradition, and sometimes we'll even nod and acknowledge the clapping as we're still playing. That's up to every individual musician. But yeah, feel free. This is a chance to express how you're feeling in the moment without worrying about strict rules and things like that. In the next 2 weeks, I'll go through the songs that we will be performing, and I'll play the originals just so you get an idea of where they're coming from. But for the rest of this, and I want to make sure I'm very careful about the time, I want to tell you a little bit the history of jazz and what is jazz anyway? And what is jazz anyway is a really important question. It doesn't have an answer. It really is jazz is whatever you want to call jazz to be. So just quickly, a little bit about the history. Jazz is known as the only unique art form the United States has given to the world. And that's a pretty big statement, but it's true. It's a melding of some traditions. Now, obviously, the strongest tradition is the Afro-American tradition. The people who originally originated from Africa were taken to the United States as slaves. So there's something we need to acknowledge here is that we are talking about a repressed minority when the music was being created. This is very much a group of people that were looked down on, often not educated in a Western sense, and having different traditions, and always seen as something strange. So we have a large group of people coming from Africa against their will, and then going to the United States as slaves. Now, when we say Africa, so many people say, "Oh, it's African music." Africa's a large continent. And to say that the styles that have come into are African is a little inaccurate from an ethnomusicologist perspective, just because what we're talking about actually is a group of people that came from mainly the west of Africa, what we call sub-Saharan Africa, from Ghana, from Senegal, the countries that we now know as Ghana and Senegal, a little bit of northern Nigeria, and especially people who lived along the Gambia River, because the slave traders would go up the river, get the people, and bring them across. So it's not African, but it's very specific styles of music that come from certain areas of West Africa. In fact, jazz has very little to do with South African music. It has very little to do with the East Coast musical traditions of Africa, and it has nothing to do with what's happened in the north and Saharan Africa and Morocco, in Egypt, etc., etc. So what we're talking about with the African aspect, we're talking about that West African. And of course, all these slaves were brought together from different areas. So their music styles all mixed up. They all intermingled. So we're bringing this African tradition, West African tradition, it also mingles with two other things. I think the most important one is music that was played at church, and very specifically, it's Western music. So the traditional Western hymns that the slaves would be hearing, completely different to the musical traditions they were bringing from Africa. So they were combining what they heard in the church, what they brought with them, and also music played by brass bands. And brass bands are the most important musical ensemble throughout Europe, throughout North America. Brass bands were the way most people heard music. They didn't hear orchestras, they didn't hear smaller ensembles. It tended to be brass bands. So, so we have this tradition of the African American influence and a little bit of the Western influence mixed up into brass music as well. So, what happened? First, we get what we call the blues. The blues comes from a very much a working song background and the idea of the spiritual. So again, it's the African American music that was sung in churches, and also these songs that they would sing in as they were working. And there's certain aspects of that older tradition which comes into the blues, which is an important precursor to what we call jazz. And one of the most important things was that the call and response. Somebody would sing something, and then the ensemble would sing it back.
Hmm.
So you have a call and then a response. And in fact, once we start getting the blues formalized, we start recording it. Most blues have this what we call an AAB form. In other words, A, a line, 4 bars are sung, then repeated. That's the call and response. And then there's usually what we call the B part, where it's something different. And the lyrics would tend to be, you know, um, my girl has left me, my girl has left me, but I'll go and get her back. A, B. And of course, female singers would be saying, my man has left me, my man has left me, but I'm going to win him back. So we have that influence of the spiritual, influence from the church music that the Afro Americans were listening to and creating themselves, and also this structure. We also get an influence of what we call music called ragtime. And ragtime is actually um, much more Western classical. The most famous composer, I think most of you may know, is Scott Joplin. He was a trained musician in the Western tradition, and he wrote down the notes in the Western tradition. Ragtime, the most important part of ragtime as a comparison to Western music is what we call syncopation. Now, normally in Western classical music, the most important notes usually occur on a strong beat. Now, what do we mean by that? So if we're talking about 4 beats to a bar, 1, 2, 3, 4, the strong beats are the 1 and the 3. So you go a da, 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 da. So everything is fitting in the beat. When we have syncopation, what happens is you start moving the notes away from those strong beats. And so it's a little bit, sometimes it's described as falling down the stairs a little bit. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4, bum, ba, 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 da, dum, da, 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 ba. And those notes are not always falling on strong and weak beats. Actually, what I might do right now is I did a very quick um, performance of a Scott Joplin piece of ragtime. Let me just get this up for you. I remember to share the sound. So this piece is called The Chrysanthemum, and I'll just play you a little bit of it. Here we go. Can I just get a thumbs up that you all heard that? Or can I have a response in the chat that you did hear that music? Because I was having some problems with sound earlier. Ah, thank you very much, my friend Julie. So that was an example of some ragtime. And the left hand is going pa, very strong beats. But you notice the right hand, ba da dee da dee da dee da dee da dee da da da. It was falling over a little bit from the beat. And that was an example of ragtime. So we have the blues, we have ragtime, we have some of the African traditions, we have a little bit of Western church music. It all gets mixed up into this now musical style, which we call jazz. And where did jazz come from? Jazz is, it's very difficult to know exactly where it started from, but historically we tend to say it was in New Orleans or New Orleans. It's very difficult for me to say that. Thank you very much for that little giggle. Around the 1890s, 1900s, we sort of start having this idea of what jazz is. And famously, the first recording, which is why we call them the music jazz, was in 1917 by the original Dixieland Jazz, and that was spelled Jass band. And this is kind of where we think jazz now starts here. So we have that mixture of the blues, we have some mixture of the ragtime, the syncopation. But now, importantly, we start having ensembles, and these ensembles become more traditional. And the original Dixieland band has a trumpet, sometimes a cornet, which is similar size thing as a trumpet. It has a clarinet, has a trombone, and they're the three main what we call front line, the instruments at the front. But they also have a rhythm section, and this is where things get a little not so stable. So often you'll have a guitar or a banjo, and banjo was quite traditional earlier. You can have a tuba or a upright string bass, boom, 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 and then drums or piano. But the drums and the piano were not part of the ensembles all the time because, of course, they still are coming from a brass band, marching band tradition, and often the musicians would be walking along the streets and playing. It's very difficult to walk with a piano. I do know this from tradition. So this is where we think jazz starts. And how did it propagate? It propagated through the riverboats. So fundamentally, what was happening was the riverboats were coming in New Orleans, Nolo, New Orleans, um, going up the Mississippi. And the music would be distributed. People would get on and off the riverboats as they went further north. It's usually a cotton trade in this example. And the music starts being developed in other cities. And the most important, well, the second most important is what we call Chicago. And which is, if you know the geography, is kind of the end of the Mississippi River. And what happened is there was another style of jazz started in Chicago. And this is where we get the larger ensembles. The Chicago jazz tends to be more about ensembles rather than what was happening in further south, the smaller groups, and also a lot of what we call improvisation. Improvisation, just improvisation. What does improvisation mean? Making stuff up. Very polite way of putting it. When you have, especially with the early jazz, the improvisations, you would have one instrument, using the trumpet, the leader, would play the melody, kind of the song that everybody knew. And then the other instruments would play around. It was sometimes playing with the melody, sometimes playing against it, trying to, and the voices sort of all intermingling. And that's kind of that tradition from earlier jazz, Dixieland jazz. But in Chicago, it was they started using larger ensembles, and then you would have a certain soloist would improvise on the song. And this is again where we're now getting this modern idea of jazz. Improvisation is key and really important element of jazz. So this is what our fundamentals of what we call jazz is. We have this ensemble group playing, and of course, our concert will have a full orchestra. I'm not too sure the number yet. I think we're getting close to 50. Um, Large ensemble, written music, everybody playing together, and there will be some improvisation as is happening. The other thing that's different about jazz, and this is you see this from ragtime, the syncopation turns into what we call swing. And swing is a way of um, shifting rhythms to be a little more modern sounding, hip, may I say. Um, Swing is difficult to define, and I ran a little workshop for the orchestra a couple of months ago. Our conductor Jim also have talked to some of the players who are not maybe not as experienced with swing. The point with swing, two different ways. What we call we subdivide our notes usually in twos or threes. And in classical music, those subdivisions are always equal. So one and two and three and four and. With jazz, it becomes unequal. And the last half of the note is a little shorter, but you also put an accent on it slightly. So it's like one, two, three, four, one and two and three and four, da da dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da da da. Why don't I play you some examples? Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play you a couple of just a couple of pieces to give you an idea of what swing is. Getting lots of messages on my screen telling me to upgrade. So let's try again. We are going to play. So I'm going to just play you a quick version, Danny Boy. And this is as if it was written. So I've said that it's Danny Boy straight. Now, what that means is that there's no swing, there's no syncopation. Now, here's a little version, same tune, recorded just a minute or two later, and this has got some syncopation. And the final example is again, it was recorded a minute or so later again. This is Danny Boy Swung. And what I'm doing here is I'm showing a bit more of the swing rhythm, but I'm also doing a lot of improvisation. We have to just let that little flourish at the end. So that gives you an idea of the music as it would have been written, and then with some syncopation, and then a little more jazzed up. So I'm going to stop here because I want to make sure that we only do 20, 25 minutes of this each time. That has given you a little bit of background of where jazz comes from, what it means. And then next week and the week after, I'll go through each of the pieces that the orchestra will be playing and talk about why, what's happening. Our first half is all about women in jazz, and that's a really important, a real important history point. And our second half is more Christmas tunes. So please come back next week and the week after if you can, and we'll go through and I'll give you some more background about what the White Rock City Orchestra is going to be doing in our concert at the end of November, and maybe some things for you to listen to. Has anybody got any questions? Besides people trying to tell me how to pronounce Nolans, New Orleans, doing the French. Thank you very much, Roy. Thank you, everybody. Thank you especially for my partner in crime, Julie, who has helped me set this up and pushing this. And I hope we'll see as many of you as possible next week. Thank you. Bye.